Good morning and welcome to our very last session of Crop Hour. Today is the last day of our Specialty Crops Week. I'm Sarah Bowder. I'm your host for the day. I'm our forage field specialist with SDSU Extension. And today our speaker is Dr. Kristine Lang. She is our horticulture state specialist, and she's been with SDSU for a few years now. And we were just discussing how Kristine does all kinds of things. So we really appreciate you, Kristine. You might have seen her speaking across the state on horticulture related topics or hosting Garden Hour, which is also a very popular webinar that happens monthly this time of year and now will pick up, I believe, and happen more frequently. So if you're interested in specialty crops and horticulture topics, Kristine is definitely the person to talk to. But before we get started this morning, just a couple housekeeping reminders. Down at the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A function that you can use to ask questions. Kristine will take questions at the end today, but if you have a question throughout the talk, you can put it there and she'll answer it at the end of her talk. There's also a chat feature. If you have trouble, you can chat us. Otherwise, if you are looking for CCA credits, the CCA credit code will be available at the very end of the day. When she's done speaking, that will be displayed and you can scan that for credits. You can't get those recorded, so you want to get those credits today. If there's any other technical glitches, just put a chat and we'll try to help you out. But otherwise, I'm going to turn it over to Kristine, who's going to talk about reducing tillage and combating weeds on South Dakota vegetable farms. What does research tell us? Thanks, Kristine.
Yeah, thank you so much for the kind introduction, Sarah, and thanks to John, who's in the background giving us tech support today. And thank you so much to all of you for joining me this morning. I know, looking at the attendee list, I can see that there are some folks who know who I am, and I'm guessing there's a few of you who are like, who in the world is this person? So yes, my name's Kristine. I'm based in Brookings, and my home department is our agronomy, horticulture, and plant science department. And I am our consumer horticulture state specialist for extension. And my research program has really grown to encompass local food and cut flower production. And for me, local food means vegetable production. My background is in sustainable agriculture and high tunnel vegetable production systems. I studied that at Iowa State University and have been fortunate to bring a lot of that work to South Dakota State in collaboration with wonderful colleagues like Rhoda Burrows and Tandy Nalea and an awesome team of graduate students. So the work I'm going to be sharing with you today is really a collaborative effort of my research team. So I will say that if you want to hear more from the graduate students themselves, I'd really encourage you to check out this YouTube playlist, which also includes like fun video footage from the field for our research program. So again, this work would not, I'm going to start with acknowledgements. I know we always do them at the end, but I'm going to start with those and also just give us a second to settle in. But this work really happens thanks to an awesome team of graduate students, research assistants, undergraduate research assistants. Some of you on the call have given me really great farming advice and insights for South Dakota. And we have many on-farm research collaborators. And also, if you're listening today, especially when I talk about where my program hopefully will go from here, if any of those types of projects are interested, we're always excited to have new on-farm trial collaborators because you know, the conditions I'm dealing with in Brookings or at our trial site in Beersford, South Dakota are, you know, not reflective of the entire state. So it's always fun to have on-farm trial collaborators. And we have great support staff from our department, extension, the Southeast Research Farm. And this work that's ongoing has been funded by the USDA Specialty Crop Block Grant, USDA NEFA Organic Transitions Grant Program, and North Central SARE Research and Education Grant Program. And while we're talking grants, for any of my commercial vegetable producers on the call or anyone who does eggs or dairy as well, a really friendly reminder that the infrastructure grants that have been advertised by South Dakota Danner to support things like cold storage or processing of vegetable crops, things like that, or fruit crops, those grants are due on March 10th. So if you have some time this weekend and want to support a purchase, there's 2 tiers. You can apply for funding for equipment purchase only, or you can think bigger and collaborate with others. So just a reminder, those grants are due on March 10th. Also, if you want to implement research on your farm or try a new practice and you're willing to share ideas with other farmers and maybe talk about your ideas or write some articles for your local newspaper and have some sort of an outreach component, the specialty crop block grants are also administered. They're a USDA program, but they're administered by Danner, and those are due March 24th. So that's really focused on marketing specialty crops or improving specialty crop production practices, whereas the infrastructure grant is really how do we kind of that middle piece of, can it support aggregation? Can it support processing? Can it help you reach a new wholesale market? Things like that. And last, but certainly not least, we've had some wonderful Master Gardener volunteers who helped us in 2023, both in Beresford and Brookings, and helped with data collection and helped with planting. And so these research results really wouldn't be possible without all of these wonderful people. So today, I'm not going to go into the deep weeds, necessarily about like different types of vegetable specialty crop weeding equipment. That would be a really fun talk for a future day. But I'm going to talk specifically about how my faculty collaborators and the graduate team, how we have approached tillage reduction and weed management by using soil tarping. And we're using using onions as our model crop, so to speak. And then using cover crops as a living mulch. And that project's just been going on a little bit longer, so I have more crops that I can share results about. So that's kind of the angle I'm coming at this. When I first got to South Dakota, both from community gardens, Master Gardener volunteers, farmers, landowners with rural properties, I started in 2021, and I actually was getting some really interesting phone calls about like, well, I haven't traveled for the last couple of years because of, COVID and all of that. And now I'm going to go on vacation for like weeks. And how should I cover crop my plots or my gardens? And then, had conversations with farmers about, how windy it is in the summer and soil's blowing away, or the weeds get away from them anyways. And is there something we could replace the weeds with? So that's kind of was my gateway into bringing cover cropping research into South Dakota. While I was in Iowa, I spent 1 year working for an organic nonprofit research institute. And I was also hearing a lot of feedback that farmers were interested in reducing plastic mulch, looking at permanent no-till raised beds. We were starting to see some soil tarping, experimentation and adoption, but we didn't really have any data for what does that look like in South Dakota, where, things are windier and we get less rainfall than, a state like Iowa or Wisconsin or Minnesota. And so there has been some really cool ongoing research, within the Midwest and in the Northeast, especially of the United States, looking at the use of soil tarping and cover crops as living mulch. But again, totally different context in terms of seasonality, maybe even the weed challenges that they're dealing with, and especially like wind and rainfall are very, very different in South Dakota. So I was very excited to kind of embark on this journey. So the slides you're going to see today have been compiled by my graduate student team, and it really is just a teaser. I would say it's about 5% of all of the data that any one of these lovely humans collected. And at the end, I am going to have a link for you to, access our deeper dive research reports. And some of those things are still being populated on the website. But just know that you're getting kind of a teaser today. So if that also helps set the context for some of the questions that you might have. So let's jump into it. So I'm going to start by talking about our soil tarping project, because Hannah kind of has the pleasure of working kind of on a new research area for us that is in collaboration with Iowa State University. So Hannah has a counterpart, Carly Strausser at Iowa State, who is doing similar research. And again, it's been really fun to compare notes because we kind of took a small scale soil tarping approach, and Iowa State took kind of a medium scale approach. and was going to try to use a little bit more mechanization for weeding their onions and use tools like finger weeders with that have the interlocking shanks that can, kind of go around the onions. And then they realized you need to have a really good tractor driver and a really good person controlling that finger weeder, or you can take out a lot of onions. Whereas we did small scale production, so our weeding methods were hand weeding. More tedious, took more time, but we were able to save some more onions in the process. And again, we all have learned a lot during this first year of research. So first, what in the world is early season soil tarping? So there's lots of ways to tarp soil with clear high tunnel, used high tunnel plastic. I've heard of people salvaging, old billboard plastic or old, vinyl signage, things like that. Silage tarps, whether reused or new. And some silage tarps you have, it's pretty easy to come by silage tarps here in a state like South Dakota, but you sometimes have a black side or a white side. And so with soil tarping, there's kind of two methods we talk about. There's occultation. And yes, it has taken me some time to get good at saying that word, so I'm probably going to mess it up. But occultation is where we're excluding light. So if we have a soil tarp with the black side up or the white side up, that's occultation. So we're trying to reduce weeds by reducing all of the sunlight so nothing can grow. And especially under those black soil tarps, so we're also heating up that soil and maybe killing some of those weed seeds. And that's kind of the end game. With solarization, that's the clear tarp where we're creating a really intense greenhouse effect under that tarp. And that light is also causing those weed seeds in the top 2 inches to germinate and flush before we plant something after it. Some people will use soil tarping in the fall to hold that soil going into winter and spring. Some people will use soil tarping to terminate cover crops without tillage. There's been a lot of work out of the University of Maine and I believe Cornell as well. There's some researchers in Michigan that are also working on that. We did not use cover crops before we tarped. And then there are people who are using soil tarping, in the middle of the season. We're done with a spring crop and we want to hold this ground and flush weeds before we come in with a fall crop. But for us, the question of interest ended up being, what can we do with soil tarping early in the season before a difficult to weed crop such as carrots or onions? And then we ultimately went with onions. So again, just another example of what occultation looks like. And these are photos from our research field in Brookings. And our design was, we looked at black side up or white side up versus clear tarps versus bare ground. And those tarps were applied 6 weeks, 4 weeks, or 2 weeks before planting. So it was staggered application times. And then all of those tarps were removed on the same day in late May. So everything was removed at the same time and all of the onions were planted at the same time. And the onions in our study were Patterson and Candy, just for my commercial vegetable folks on the call. And again, with the onions, we know that they're difficult to weed. So we wanted to look at a crop that was really susceptible to competition for weeds. And some of the questions of interest was, how was tarping impacting weed management? How did tarping impact or not impact onion yield? And then this would be a whole nother presentation, but Hannah also spent a lot of time using sensors to track soil moisture. She did pre and post tarping soil sampling and worked very closely with Chris Graham from our West River station to do a lot of soil analysis and unpack, are we having an impact on soil microbial activity when these soils are heating up underneath the tarps? So here's a kind of a snapshot of that research timeline. We did start our onions in the greenhouse. We had a target planting date of May 17th. If we all recall, last year, there was a ton of snow. And when we wanted to do our 6 weeks prior to planting tarping date, there was just way too much snow on the ground and we had to push everything back by 2 weeks. So I know that I acknowledge that May 30th is pretty late for planting onions, but that was another thing, thinking about a systems perspective, we're trying to see, like, will this even make sense if we wanted to use something like this with tarping to reduce tillage ahead of a crop like onions? Can we even still get a really nice onion crop? And overall, we did get a nice onion crop, but I just acknowledge that some of you are like, those are really late planting dates. And it was. We are going to go back to targeting mid-May for onion planting this year in the field. And looking at our conditions outside and knocking on some wood right now, we should be soil tarping like the first week of April this year. So kind of moving those planting dates back up 2 weeks. So these are what things looked like at tarp removal. Black silage tarps, there was really nothing under there except like a few etiolated dandelions. And etiolated means like white and stretched out and really, really sad looking because they're trying to find sunlight. So that's kind of what you can see, maybe right here and here is some of those dandelions that were really trying to grow. The solarization. The goal with that, again, is to exhaust that weed seed bank. So you actually want everything to flush, and then you would mow it down, or maybe you would use like 1 point of intentional tillage. Sometimes this is kind of that stale seed bed method too. So some people have also considered, okay, I heat it up, I mow it down, I tarp it again, but we were just a tarp it once and remove it. So, and that's what things look like under the clear tarps. So I will acknowledge for the clear tarps and the bare ground controls, light tillage was used because we tried to take the mindset of like, what would we do in a true farm system? And if you had this, this weedy mess, you're probably not going to plant right into it because you're not setting yourself up for success. So light tillage was used to get rid of that plant material. And then we very shallowly harrowed, so more of this kind of tillage right prior to transplanting the onions into the field, just in row. So again, this was not a true no-till system. This was an intentional, how do we reduce tillage? So some examples of the weed pressure throughout the growing season. So you have June 12th, which was actually our first post-planting data collection event for weed biomass, July 5th and July 18th. So overall, through using wheel hose and then, some careful hoeing / some hand weeding was needed, just hand pulling between the onion rows. That weed bed seed bank was starting to get exhausted by July and things were really clean. But early in the season, even, tarping or no tarping, we did start to see the weeds start to flush and pick up. And Hannah has that represented graphically in just a moment. Just a primer on how we collected weed biomass for all of our study groups. We basically use PVC squares so that you have a known area, and we count weeds. In Hannah's study, we sorted by grasses and broadleafs, and we bag. So we count all of those weeds, the number of grasses, the number of broadleafs, and we put them in separate paper bags. And then we dry those and weigh them to get calculations for weed biomass. And we tend to think about that in pounds per acre or number of weeds per square foot, because there is research that says, if you have this much weed biomass, you can kind of expect yield decreases of this much. So it's a way for us to have kind of an apples to apples comparison of how a control bare ground plot versus different cover cropping treatments or soil tarping treatments, what is the actual weed biomass? And so two of the weeds that were really prevalent in Hannah's research plots, tarping or no tarping, was Venice mallow, which is on the left, and she's showing you really small ones, and red root pigweed, which is shown there on the right. And I just want to give kudos to my entire team. They've all become really good at weed identification. And I'm going to say that they're better at it than I am. I will definitely give them props for that. But so those were two of the weeds that Hannah was seeing a lot. When we first removed those tarps under the clear tarps, it was a lot of grasses. So we were dealing with way more grasses than broadleafs, I would say, as someone who was out there in the field helping sort grasses and broadleafs with the students. So the broadleafs kind of followed after that. And so here's what, kind of general trends between black, clear, control, and white, what that looked like early in the season. and as the season progressed. So May 30th, that's when tarps were removed. So it really makes sense that control plots had more weeds. Clear plots had that flush of weeds, and under black and white tarps, really no weeds because there was no sunlight for them to photosynthesize and grow. And then what we see is a peak for black and white tarps. What we kind of did is we pushed the weed problem down the road, if you will. So weeds did get bad in those first few weeks, and then we had to have like a huge rescue operation of weeding. And you can see here that, and again, these are kind of general trends. I don't have the statistical analysis on this, this full bar graph. So think of this as trends, but you can see with the clear tarps, well, we had that initial flush, we already were starting to cure the problem. So something to think about. But with the clear tarps, it also didn't get hot enough for long enough to completely kill everything. And it's important to remember that these were the 6-week tarping treatments. And here's what that looked like for grasses. So the control and the clear, we had grasses. And then interestingly, plots that had white tarps on them, and after removal, grasses really spiked under there, which there was, sorry about that, less of an intense spike for black tarps. And again, you can see through multiple weeding events, everything kind of levels out towards the end of the season. But we still had a lot of that early season competition for our onions. Here's another way to look at this. So this was broadleaf weed count by all of the tarp treatment combinations. And this is in Hannah's online publication, so you can dig way deeper on this. And this was on June 12th, which was that first big weed event where things were really starting to peak and be problematic. And again, I just want to share, so anything with letters, whether it's a bar graph or anything in a table, if it has the same letter, any 2 letters, those things are not statistically different from one another. So I can confidently tell you that 4-week black tarps had more broadleaf weeds per square foot than 2-week black tarps, which was actually really interesting. And we can see that clear tarps had somewhat less weeds on June 12th compared to, compared to not very many things, compared to like 2-week white and 4-week black. And so looking at this bar graph, the extension-y or even scientific response to this is things were kind of all over the board, which was a little bit surprising. What this might indicate is that, 2, 4, 6 weeks, there's not enough difference in that timeline for us to see really, to confidently say we're having really good weed control. So that's one thing that we think about for this study. But again, this is only 1 year of data. And with a second year and having all of that data put together, maybe we can tease apart some more differences between weed control. So again, I know that was like a bite of what we did for soil tarping, but some takeaways: you are reducing weeds early in the season compared to bare ground. Clear type tarps definitely had a flush of grass weeds. And again, using flail mowing, which is not going to kill those grasses, but might kill the broadleafs if that is your only issue. Or using some shallow tillage, or if you wanted to do, a spray down with herbicide, again, making sure it's labeled for use on vegetable fields and you're not going to have any nasty carryovers that's going to knock things out. Those would be options. But again, we went with the light tillage, and the weeding and harrowing were still necessary throughout the season. So, soil tarping, the way we're looking at it early in the season, is probably going to have to be stacked with some of those other practices. And we've had a lot of farmer feedback about interest about, could you tarp and then potentially flail mow and tarp again. And I think there's so many ways that we really can be creative with soil tarping. And so if you are someone who's using soil tarping and would like to, share any of your feedback or ideas with that, I'll have my contact information at the end, and Hannah and I would love to hear from you. And I will share, I didn't really focus on yield data for this, but tarping did not improve or reduce onion yields. The only thing we really found for yield is that Patterson yielded more than Candy in our particular study. So just something to consider. And again, there's way more information in this and Hannah's full online report. So let's transition to clovers as a living mulch. And I'm realizing that I have a lot of things that I want to share with you about this, and we're just gonna see how far we get. So this work really started in 2022, and we have research sites in Brookings and Beersford, and we have farmer collaborators. And we have now built on this work to look at longer term impacts on soil health. And that's in collaboration with Dr. Sudi Yu and some new on-farm collaborators. So our living mulch cover cropping research sites at the Southeast Farm, we're going to have those for several more years. And we're looking at different crops within that system. So just know that this is kind of a project that started with Alexis examining year 1 of clover living mulch establishment and how crops do in that year. And then Connor Roon is looking at year 2. Jocelyn Fausert looked at year 2, and we're onboarding a new graduate student who is also going to look at years 2, 3, and 4 of cropping in these clover systems. And we've seen some different responses based on, the maturity of the clover and if we do or do not have rainfall. So that's a snapshot of where those field locations are. Our first on-farm collaborator was Bud and Peggy of Cedar Creek Gardens, and they gave us some fantastic feedback. Things we weren't expecting were, birds eating all of the oat nurse crop and picking it out of the ground after it was planted. Hail taking out vegetable crops after we planted. So, and just lack of moisture in the middle part of the state made clover establishment. I knew it would be hard, but we'll just say it's been very difficult in the moisture limited site. So we're going to have to think about using clover living mulches, providing supplemental irrigation to get them going is going to be key if you want to use a perennial legume crop in your system. I've had people ask about, going back to, should we be looking at alfalfa? Should we be looking at black medic or something else? And those are all great questions. And again, I really encourage on-farm trialing too. Don't bet the whole farm on it, but if you have some strips and you can do some side-by-side comparisons, I encourage you to do that. And I would love to hear your feedback on how that system's working. I will say that we're going to embark on a new project in 2024, looking at some warm season drought tolerant cover crops and looking at pest management strategies as well as disease management strategies. So for those of you who have heard from Sean Toporek yesterday, he is the lead of that research team. So just stay tuned because we're going to be looking at kind of a different suite of cover crops as living mulch. So when I talk about living mulch, I'm talking about a continuous cover of cover crops. When we traditionally use cover crops, we plant, a field, a plot, a stand of cover crops. We mow them, we spray them with approved herbicides, or we till them in or soil tarp them to terminate them. And then we, pull plastic mulch, plant vegetables, and have bare ground conditions. When I talk about living mulch, this is, having cover between our vegetable planting rows or even within our vegetable planting rows, which is a true living mulch. So instead of a plastic mulch, instead of a straw mulch, you actually have a clover cover crop right underneath the peppers or the sweet corn or whatever you're growing. And a lot of research has demonstrated yield decreases due to that. So one of my questions of interest when I designed this research was, can we have tillage of this strip or laid landscape fabric, which at least we can reuse, so it's slightly better than disposable plastic mulch. But can we guard against yield loss by using some of these in-row management strategies? But these were the 3 clovers we are using: white Bikira cross, a white clover, and a red clover. And that red clover has that deeper taproot and is going to be the shortest lived cover crop in this system. And we compared this to no clover bare ground plots. And here's an overview of those management treatments for within the planting rows. So we had treatment plots that were tilled with a BCS and then just left, tilled bare ground. between the clover. We had no till, no fabric, and we had tilled plus woven landscape fabric with cauterized planting holes. And then we had no tillage, and we honestly just like mowed the cover crop down and put landscape fabric right on top of it, which made it, a little difficult to get it tighter to the ground. But again, we're trying to look at ways to reduce tillage as well. And planting rows were 30 feet long at Southeast Farm and 12 feet long at the specialty crop field on campus. The cash crops in Alexis's research have been broccoli on campus and Jester delicata squash at the Southeast Farm. Again, we wanted to look at different, a cool season versus a warm season, a very compact compared to squash, a compact upright crop versus a vining crop, so that we could have some different, different crop behavior within these living mold systems. And here's just an overall picture of what those plots look like in the field. So you can see that some plots have landscape fabric and are waiting to be planted. Some plots are just those tilled strips between the clover cover crop. And again, these were clovers that were established in April, the same year that the cash crop was planted. So this is the timeline of activities for the broccoli on campus. And again, so that April planting date and we targeted this as a fall broccoli crop. And then here's the squash. And what we have learned at Southeast Farm is we didn't have enough natural rainfall. And by the time we realized like these clovers are not establishing, it was getting a little late for a sprinkler rescue operation. So we did not have great clover establishment at squash. So just to keep that in mind for context. Some of the most problematic weeds in the broccoli fields on campus, it was green and yellow foxtails. We have a healthy crop of Canada thistle, crabgrass, woolly cupgrass, perennial sow thistle, dandelions, and purslane. And then in squash, I can vouch for this. Definitely velvet leaf, definitely red-footed pigweed, lots of lamb's quarter, foxtail, a little bit of water hemp, kochia, giant foxtail, and field plantain. And again, those cover crops were becoming, or those weeds were becoming the cover crops at the Southeast Farm. So we really were having to just maintain that by mowing, again, in the interest of using less tillage. Again, just more photos of some of the weeds, and again, some fun one-offs like Western salsify. And yeah, those pigweed photos, that's definitely from our Southeast Farm plots, because there just wasn't clover or really oat nurse crop establishment to keep things down. Here are some photos of the broccoli and squash harvest in both sites, and you can see research assistants and volunteers and all of the lovely folks who helped with that for Alexis's research project. So some key things to consider. Early season moisture was needed, and it's here in Brookings, we did sprinkler irrigate, so we did have good clover establishment. But again, had we not had that human intervention, research on campus would have looked way different. Early season weeds were very, very vigorous. Also, for any of you who have been following this work, in 2022, we did have a pepper crop. We were supposed to have a pepper crop in 2023, and we knew temperatures were going to get cold right before we planned to put out the peppers, but they got way colder than we expected, and it was a hard lesson in when in doubt, use a frost blanket or bring those plants back in, because we had everything out to harden for field planting like the next week, and we iced the crop. So we did not have a pepper crop this year. Just a few things to look at for data. So this is, when we say whole plot, what we mean is how did the clover and the pathways look? So between the planting rows. And I'm going to call your attention primarily to the plant biomass on the right-hand side of this graphic. And this is early season, so this is June at the specialty crops. So this is June in Brookings, and there was not a significant difference between any of the clover treatments. And then when we look at, were any of these clovers suppressing weeds more than others? because there is an A behind all three of these clover amounts of, this is six to 800 pounds of weed biomass per acre. But because those are all A's, what that tells us is in the early season, clover was not suppressing, one clover over another was not suppressing weeds. And we actually had less weeds in our bare ground plots. And I will share that, in our clover plots, we were mowing. In our bare ground plots, after we collected data, we did go through and, wheel hoe, hand pull, clean up those plots. So similar to what we saw in Hannah's research, as time went on, those bare ground plots, that weed seed bank is being exhausted. Now we're also not introducing any new tillage into these clover plots, but if perennial weeds are poking up above that clover and we're mowing it, especially, things with a rosette growth habit or our grasses, they're just going to keep growing because we're not actually, spraying them with herbicide or pulling the whole thing out. We're just mowing. So that just is one, thing to think about for an explanation for, wait a minute, why are the weeds lower in the bare ground? So looking at, move ahead, there we go. So looking at October 3rd, and again, this is in the pathways. And I'm just going to, again, call your attention back to the right-hand side. Clovers had more biomass than bare ground, because there wasn't clover planted in the bare ground. But again, statistically, there was no difference between the amount of plant growth among red, white, or that white bicura clover cross. And what we also see is there was no difference. Well, if we think about, the volume of weed biomass from early season versus October, weeds were, less at the end of the season, but we still didn't actually see a difference between like this clover is suppressing weeds more than the other. So I thought that was really interesting. Sharing the broccoli yield analysis. This is really where the rubber meets the road if you're considering this type of system. Overall, a key takeaway is, we had more marketable broccoli heads in a bare ground system. For broccoli grown within any of the Cura clover. So again, that's the white bicura cross, the red clover, that's what RC stands for, or the white clover. My whole intention with, using landscape fabric and tilled strips was trying to protect against yield loss. And we didn't really accomplish that in the sense of, in very many cases. So we can see that tillage plus landscape fabric in Cura clover, for example, did guard against yield loss compared to just tilled without landscape fabric, or like that no-till system where broccoli was planted directly into clovers. And we kind of see a similar trend in red clover and white clover. So tilled plus fabric can protect against yield loss, but if you're looking at the general trend of, these solid bars, you'll see, but bare ground still appears to have done way better overall. And like, can I afford to have half of my broccoli crop not head? Now, one thing we did realize kind of after the fact with Alexis's work is, the bare ground broccoli was also heading way faster. So one thing to potentially consider if you're looking at this system is use of like a totally bare ground system, but versus having some of your broccoli in a clover living mulch system with the different strip till patterns, is you're actually kind of delaying your broccoli heading. And that, depending on your marketing system, might actually be an advantage. But just, being prepared for like how much yield loss are you willing to accept? So that's something that I want to call out or ask you to consider as you think about this. I'm going to just pause for a minute and actually jump out. And I'm actually maybe just going to jump ahead, because I will just say that the clover biomass was kind of non-existent at the Southeast farm. So that's probably the key takeaway, and just in the interest of time. And what we saw really across the board, those patterns with broccoli of yield reduction in the clover plots, like that yield gap between bare ground and clovers was even more measurable in squash. So we were kind of hoping that squash could canopy over the clover, grab on, not be thrown around by the wind. But we're really seeing that the delicata squash was very sensitive to being planted with the clover. And again, in year one with these clover systems, those clovers are still rooting and establishing and are, somewhat nitrogen taking versus nitrogen giving in terms of benefits. And we used I'll just pull it up because I have it right here, but the Midwest Vegetable Guide, we used their nitrogen recommendations based on soil tests for both sites. And there are some researchers who are reporting, we're increasing our nitrogen inputs in a living mulch system by 25 to 50%. And I don't have the data in front of me on that, but I think it's a new angle that I'd like to think about for my research, that, we need nitrogen to support the cover crop, and we also need nitrogen to support the cash crop. So using, by the book recommendations for a system that doesn't include living mulch, we're probably under fertilizing some of our crops. And we definitely saw that just in like visual appearance of our squash. And Alexis actually took tissue samples and found, like, yes, nitrogen was less. We were limiting. So again, key findings: we need more rainfall, or you need to irrigate to establish that cover crop. Cash crops should definitely be considered when you're integrating things into these living mulch systems. And we're going to continue to look at a variety of cash crops. And we also just in general struggled with some insects pests such as vine borer. And then we have found that voles and field mice love crawling around under that landscape fabric. So we now put all drip irrigation tubing on top of our landscape fabric versus under it, because it's just a super highway under there and they just roam around and bite off the drip tape, and we were repairing constantly. So we've now put our drip tape on top of the landscape fabric. Ours is not buried because, again, this was, a tillage or no-till study. So we had to put it on the surface for consistency. So those are some things to consider. And I do want to pay tribute to looking at these established clover living mulches and looking at an alternative cropping system. So Connor Roon is looking at year 2 of Alexis's living mulch plots, and Jocelyn Faustert also took a look at that. So these are established clover plots so that you have a nice, healthy, robust cover of clover crops. So this is one of the examples of the plots, and we just have much more covered pathways. And this was just after a mowing event. And so you can see on the left-hand side, this is a great example of what red clover looks like if you don't mow it down. And so that's a true no-till living mulch plot right there. And as you might imagine, putting any type of a vegetable transplant into that, like, it's going to be pretty silly. It's not really going to work. So we kind of knew that, but it was just another control within our study. So Connor took his research a different angle, and it's been really, really fun. There's some research out there on broccolini, but not a lot. So if folks are growing broccolini and have had good, bad experience or otherwise, I'd love it if you'd shoot me an email that I could share with Connor, because we'd love to hear those experiences, your favorite planting dates, your favorite varieties. These are the 4 that Connor decided to go with. He went with Melody, BC 1611, Burgundy, and Bernarda. So we had 2 purple and 2 green. And if you're like, what's the difference between broccoli and broccolini? Broccolini is a cross between 2 different types of broccoli. And you might hear broccolini described as sprouting broccoli. So instead of having one nice head, the beauty of broccolini is you have all of these nice shoots, and it's kind of a cut and come again crop so that you can have more of a continuous harvest. And it doesn't always look as like pretty or neat and tidy, but I think we're seeing more consumers like figure out what it is. And broccolini tends to be a little bit more heat tolerant as well. So as we think about, getting warmer summers and longer seasons. I'm hearing more and more reports of people struggling to do really good early season broccoli, and then they're having to only do a fall broccoli crop. So I think broccolini, it has some potential regardless of if you use it in a living mulch system or not. So if you're not already using broccolini, take a look and keep me posted, and then also watch for more research from us. This is an overview of all of the data that Connor collected. He was an agronomy undergraduate at SDSU, and he's really interested in soils and kind of those longer term impacts on soil health. So he spends a lot of time thinking about and measuring those things, which is really exciting for our team. So here are some of the key dates for his project. We went with a fall broccolini planting. We had a lot of different ideas for the directions we wanted to go with Connor's research, but we kind of had to pivot our plan, like you all might have to do in farming. And so that's one of the reasons that we had this fall broccolini planting date. And then harvests were September through October. Had we not gotten what I'm going to call the Halloween hard freeze, I think Connor could have been harvesting broccolini into like Thanksgiving, because all of his plots were under row cover, and that was for pest management primarily and protection from the deer. Our field site on the Brookings campus has a small fence to keep the jackrabbits out, but as we know, small fences are something deer laugh at, and we're working towards bigger and better fencing. But we decided to just do a 2-for-1 and do a woven protect net style row cover to keep deer from eating the broccolini and to keep insects, pests out of there as well. So here's an example of what it looked like for Connor's water infiltration data. His report should be online in a week or two, so you can do a much deeper dive on that. He also has looked at soil compaction. We're kind of seeing compaction readings all over the board, whereas with infiltration, there is a clear trend of those true no-till plots within the planting rows. Water infiltration is definitely better. Just more water is going into that soil at a much faster rate. And that is pretty exciting because it just goes to show by having, again, some of those things we know about those soil health principles of continuous cover and reducing tillage, even after 1 year of management, we're already seeing improvements in soil health. So again, the weed pressure in Connor's plots, remembering that going into the winter and coming out, into the spring and until July, these plots were covered with clovers, or they were control plots where more weeds were just flushing and growing. So there was kind of an initial flush of annual weeds when the clovers were small, or coming out of dormancy and regrowing early in the season. So that was yellow foxtail, pigweed, lamb's quarter. Perennial weeds such as dandelion and sow thistle and Canada thistle persisted throughout the season because they're already rooted in and able to kind of keep up with the clover. And then large crabgrass was an issue in the red clover treatments because red clover tends to be more upright versus spreading horizontally. And so that crabgrass could grow in those pockets of sunlight. And so there's some examples of the thistle pressure. And it's showing, from the start of the season, to the end of the season, just the overall clover biomass. There is some research, and I'm thinking of this more from a cereal rye perspective, but once you start to get towards 8,000 pounds of, cover crop biomass or more per acre, that's really that point where you have good weed suppression. You can see as the clover, kind of grew throughout the season, we were starting to reach that point. And then this is just thinking about weeds, if we were to total up, from weed measurements throughout the entire growing season, what would that look like at the end of the season? And you can see that our bare ground plots, there were way, way, way more weeds collected from those plots than clovers. So from a weed suppression perspective, established clovers are doing what we want them to do. Connor also is spending time looking at nodules, and again, that's going to be kind of another soil/plant health metric. But let's quickly look at some yield results. So what we see here, and we ended up looking at yield response for each variety of broccolini, and only 3 of those actually produce shoots. One of them did not vernalize properly with our late season plantings. So we need to think about how we're going to vernalize those pull them out of the greenhouse, find, a cool walk-in cooler, vernalize them, and then get them outdoors. So we didn't actually see shoot production for one of the varieties of broccolini. But I will just say what excites me about these year 1 results, and again, I look forward to next year, is if you'll recall, we had really stark patterns with squash and broccoli where, the trend with bare ground is way more yield. And if you look at this, I am kind of excited that the bars in general are a little bit more all over the board and there's not this clear pattern, because this shows the potential that broccolini might not be as impacted by the competition of clover cover crops. And that's super exciting to me, because I'm really curious what crops might fit in the system. Again, this is year 1, so I want to temper that enthusiasm. But this is something, we're really excited to, keep tracking the data for next year. Because, if you were to just be like, Kristine, should I plant broccoli in a living mulch system? I'm probably going to tell you no. Like, I don't think that's a great idea. But I think there's some potential with broccolini. And again, this was one variety. And there's a lot of interest just across the board in the scientific community to look at what varieties are going to do better in conjunction with reduced tillage systems or, changes in fertility regimes or in collaboration, in collaboration with cover crops. That sounds very positive. So I think this is an area we're just going to continue to see. I want to keep working on this, and I think we're going to continue to see more people working on these types of systems. So this is BC 1611, so the other green broccolini. Again, similar things. And again, we're seeing that the use of in-row management strategies, so things like landscape fabric or some tillage. So we're going to have, some soil disturbance or some modification. We still can't plant broccolini straight into an established clover crop unless you really want to take the yield hit. Totally your choice. But we're seeing that, by using some of these strip management strategies, we can at least have covered pathways that are covered with cover crop and mown and protect against yield loss. And similar-ish trends with burgundy, which was one of the purple broccolini. So again, year 1 results, but exciting things to think about. We are really excited to dig deeper, pun intended, on all of the soil health metrics. Connor has another year of research that he's going to be getting underway in just a few weeks, actually. We are going to add an early season planting of broccolini this year, and then we're going to replicate that late season planting of broccolini so that we can also get a wider spectrum of, how does broccolini do in these systems early in the season versus late. So stay tuned for those results. And I think I just want to do right by Jocelyn Faucert, who was a fantastic research assistant this summer and did very dedicated, diligent work for cabbage production. And I would say a key takeaway we learned with her 3 cabbage varieties is that they were quite sensitive to being planted in the living mulch systems. And of her 3 cabbage varieties, only 2, Ferrera and Famosa, had a marketable crop that was ready to harvest before some of those really hard fall frosts. So I'm going to jump ahead without making anyone seasick because I want to encourage you. I just want to land on a couple of pages. Jocelyn wrote really cool articles about how she did integrated pest management with beneficial flowers. So I'll just leave that there for a second and encourage you to grab the QR code. And I have a hunch that John would be kind enough to put that link in the chat for you as well. So I encourage you to check that out. And then if you're curious, how in the world does cabbage harvest and grading work? Jocelyn also wrote a really nice article about how she approached cabbage harvest from a very, what would it look like if we're going into like a wholesale market where they're going to be really picky about those grading standards. And I'm going to let John put that in the chat for you as well. And then I'm just going to jump ahead to some key takeaways from Jocelyn's work. And again, we're going to have a second year of this as well, so stay tuned for even more results. So, some key takeaways Jocelyn recommended: planting late maturing cabbage earlier, because that's what we ran into with Diodon, is we did not get good head formation. Planting at higher cover crop seeding rates in drought conditions. And again, making sure that we have good early season moisture, definitely using those cover crops and pathways only, for whether it's Alexis's work, Connor's work, or Jocelyn's work. Having planting straight into living mulch cover crops is just not going to be viable for South Dakota. And realizing there are going to be yield trade-offs. And I think this is a great takeaway for all four of the researchers, is just stay tuned for our results from the 2024 growing season. We're going to have field days and chances to engage in person. We'll continue to publish and share our results with all of you. And if any of you know me well, you can expect another webinar on this topic, and we'll look forward to seeing you again. You can do a deeper dive to read about all of this work, both on the Southeast Farm by reading their annual report. Alexis and Jocelyn, their work is published there. Our horticulture research tab, Hannah, Alexis, and Connor will have research published there. And work from Hannah and Alexis is already up, and Connor's results are going to be posted soon. And I'm guessing John can also share those in the chat for you. Sorry, John, I'm keeping you busy. If you aren't already subscribed, I would encourage you to sign up for our Garden and Yard newsletter, because that is the space where horticulture events, research findings, articles about things like beneficial flowers for organic crop production. That is where all of those things land and are sent out on a bi-weekly basis. And last but not least, I did ask all of you to contact me, and would love to hear from you or hear your perspectives, or catch me next time you see me in person. But if you want to know, anything that our team has written, I would encourage you to scan that QR code, or just jump to my research, or jump to my article page, because that includes both our fun articles as well as our research findings. And I do see that Chris had one question from earlier in the webinar about, do I think the cultivation on the clearer tart plots impacted the weed flush in June? And I'm going to say definitely. We know that anytime we disturb soil, we're going to, especially if we disturb soil below those, 2 inches, then we're bringing new weeds up, which is why we tried to keep that tillage really shallow. And it's also why for onion planting, we went with very shallow harrowing and stirred the soil this way, in the interest of not stirring up new weed seeds. So lots of different angles for us to consider, and would love to talk further about that down the road. So I realize that our time is quickly coming to a close. I've really appreciated having everybody engaged in today's session. This will be recorded and posted online if there's anything you'd like to go back to. But I will say, if you want to dig deeper and process any of the data or information, definitely do check out our research reports as well. And there has also been a poll open. So if you would just take a moment to complete that poll, we would certainly appreciate it. I thank you all for spending the morning with me. I always enjoy talking about these things, and hope that everyone has a great day and gets to enjoy the sunshine. And if you'd like to get more horticultural information, the next spot to find our team will be the first Tuesday in April at 7 p.m. Central, 6 p.m. Mountain Time. And we will have our last one-off garden hour. So that's kind of our special issue of garden hour. I know I will be hosting, so I'll be talking about probably some of our summer plans. I believe we're going to have Laura Edwards on there talking about weather forecasts. So that would be a fun one to tune into. And then our regularly scheduled garden hour will be every single Tuesday night, 7 p.m. Central, 6 p.m. Mountain. from May through the end of August. And again, that's a great way to get those timely in-season updates from John Ball, Rhoda Burrows, Amanda Bachman, myself, and a whole host of our friends of horticulture. And with that, I want to thank you for attending today's webinar and have an excellent day.